Hi, Charles as the Book Sage here, and I figured it was time for me to finally give my thoughts on the upcoming Rings of Power Amazon TV show. Now, I will be watching, but I'll be approaching the show the same way I approach seasons 5 through 8 of A Game of Thrones, as pretty much a loosely inspired sort of fan fiction story, not any actual adaptation of Tolkien's Legendarium. Like, for example, the Game of Thrones show, seasons 1 through 4, to me, are an adaptation of parts of A Song of Ice and Fire. But seasons 5 through 8 were like fanfic. So in this video, I'm going to give you 3 main reasons why I'm going to be approaching it this way. So let's get started. The first reason has to do with the timeline. Now, the Second Age is roughly 3,500 or so years in length. Now, the showrunners could have decided to pick one main event from somewhere in that Second Age and over 5 seasons tell that story, and they chose not to. They could have also picked 5 major events scattered throughout the Second Age, and each season would be a complete story arc, so that every season the human cast would change, but the cast of actors playing the elves would be the same. That would allow the viewer to see over 5 seasons the slow breakdown of the Númenóreans and their growing resentment and envy of the immortality and permanence of the elves. It would really get that central core part of what leads to the corruption and fall of Númenor. Again, that would mean every season there would be a different cast of human characters. And they decided not to do that as well. What they're doing instead is plucking out, across 3,500 or so years, all these different events, and then mashing them all together, as they're all generally happening at the same time. To put this in perspective, imagine if you go to the theater, sit down to watch a movie. Opening scene, the Allies are storming the beaches of Normandy on D-Day, and then it cuts to the next scene, and it's George Washington crossing the Delaware. And then the third scene is Leonidas and the Spartans trying to hold the hot gates in Thermopylae against the Persians. And then you cut to the 4th scene, and Moses is leading the Jews in their exodus out of Egypt. And all of these are being presented in the movie as they're all happening at the same time, like on the same day. That's the level of timeline compression that they're doing in the show. And that alone would make it just impossible to be anything even remotely called an adaptation. And I think the showrunners and Amazon have kind of realized that they really can't present it as an adaptation. So they've recently started adapting their marketing a bit. So I think the most recent thing said inspired by, instead of like from the works of or whatever they were calling it in the beginning. And I think that's a bit more accurate framing. Now, reason number 2 why I'm approaching this as kind of just a loosely inspired story has to do with the dwarves. Now, so far from what we've seen, apparently we're going to have King Doran III and his son Prince Doran IV. Now, King Doran III was one of the people who received one of the 7 rings that went to the dwarves. He actually received that ring pretty early on in the grand scheme of the rings of power being distributed out to people. So he pretty much has to be in the story then, unless they're going to make a change. The issue here, though, is there can't be 2 Dorans alive at the same time. For those who may not be aware, all the dwarves are descended, I think, from 7 original dwarves. The first one being Durin. Durin is considered the father of all dwarves in Arda. And that's a sacred name among the dwarven people. You don't just name your kid Durin. Now, Tolkien doesn't get into the details of how the dwarves would know this, but every once in a while, one of them gives birth to a dwarf who is so alike in appearance, in countenance, and temperament to the original Durin that they're believed to be Durin himself reincarnated. And then that dwarf is given the name Durin. And again, he doesn't explain how they would even know this, but that's just a thing. There is never 2 Dorans alive at the same time, and they're not father and son. Each Doran is born like potentially hundreds of years apart from each other, and they come along when there's a great need among its people. And yet the show, for some reason, has 2 Dorans alive at the same time, and which is a really bizarre choice. It's like just a completely unnecessary, like unforced error on the part of these writers and the showrunners. Like, they haven't really given any explanation for why. I mean, they're just like, this is like canon shattering thing. It might seem minor, but this is like a foundational part of who these people are as a society and a culture. and it's just really strange. Now, I was expecting that they're just going to kill Doran the Third off pretty early. Like, it wouldn't surprise me if he like dies in like a collapse of a mine in Khazad-dûm somewhere, and maybe they end up just giving the ring that was given to Doran the Third to Prince Doran the Fourth instead. I wouldn't be surprised if something like that happens. Now, there's a really interesting theory that I just heard for the first time like a couple of nights ago, and that people are theorizing that Doran the Third isn't really there, and that Doran the Fourth kind of imagines him being there, like as sort of a imaginary advisor. And that theory is kind of nutty, but I understand why people have come up with that theory, because they're trying to salvage their really not being two Durans alive at the same time, because they know that that's just like canon shattering. But again, if you approach this not as any canon faithful adaptation, but just a very loosely inspired story that kind of just has Tolkien names in it, there really isn't canon involved in this show. All by itself, even if they had just picked one story or done 5 separate like stories throughout the ages, this alone makes it impossible for me to view it as an adaptation. Now, the third reason why I'm approaching it as a loosely inspired kind of fan fiction story has to do with something I saw in the very first teaser trailer that was released like 5 months ago. I lasted 46 seconds into that teaser trailer when I was like, I'm out. This is not okay. This is not going to be an adaptation of Tolkien. This is just going to be a story they've come up with that's very, very like just has some Tolkien pieces thrown in it. And that moment in the trailer is when Galadriel is in the water and you see a man's hand reach out and like lift her hair up to expose her ears, presumably looking to see if she's an elf. That might seem like a nothing burger to you, but that was like kind of a deal breaker for me taking this show as any adaptation. And I will explain why. Galadriel is one of the High Elves. She grew up in Valinor among the light of the 2 trees, and you saw those 2 gigantic trees in one of the trailers, like the golden tree and the silver tree. And most elves have dark hair, except the particular line that Galadriel's from. They have the golden hair. And Galadriel's hair, though, is unique among most of the elves because her hair is golden and silver. It's a mix of the two. And it has a soft luminescence to it, almost like it glows ever so slightly. And it's almost like as if the light of the 2 trees like caught in her hair and stayed there. And Feanor, her cousin, who is my all-time favorite character Tolkien ever created, one of my all-time favorite characters in literature, and the most arrogant character you will ever come across, ever. Like, think of every arrogant character you've ever read, Achilles and anyone else. Yeah, they're like little kittens compared to Feanor. He's a fascinating character. He's one of those characters that he can make or break the world, and he does. He's like the kind of a character who's so powerful, his presence is so powerful, like the world is dragged kicking and screaming in his wake, whether they want to or not. But anyway, he was obsessed with Galadriel's hair, and 3 times asked for a lock of it, and 3 times she denied him. Which, quick side note, that's why when Gimli asked her for a lock of hair all those thousands of years later, she gives Gimli the 3 locks she denied her cousin Feanor. So even like thousands and thousands and ages later, Feanor's presence is still being felt in some manner, and that's her kind of giving her long dead cousin like a little less like sick burn. And but anyway, even Feanor, as arrogant as he was, as obsessed as he was with her hair, he would never dare touch it. So to have somebody in this scene just so casually lift her hair up is that's just like, I can't even process like why they would do that. After watching that teaser when it first came out like 10 times, I was like, the only possible way this works in story or in show is whoever that is, that has to be Sauron. So there is a rumor going around that a particular character is actually Sauron. I'm not going to say that rumor here just in case you haven't heard it and you don't want to have any potential spoilers. But I will just say this. If the person in that scene is who I think it is, lifting her hair up, and it is the person that matches the rumor, then I believe that rumor is absolutely 100% true. Because outside of her husband, Celeborn, or her daughter, Celebrian, who both seem to be like persona non grata for some bizarre reason in the show, at least at the start, those are the only two that would touch her hair. And no one else would dare. No human would be able to. One look from her would just daunt any person, and they wouldn't be able to do it. And because one of the things the show seems to not be capturing, at least just from the little clips I've seen, is how different the elves are from humans. There doesn't really seem to be much of that otherworldliness to them. Seems to be missing so far from the footage we've seen. And we haven't seen a lot, but still, you know, there's no mistaking one of the elves, especially someone like Galadriel, who's considered like a high elf in a sense. I mean, they stand out, like massively stand out. I think Morfydd Clark is a great choice to play young Galadriel, but if she's just standing in a crowd, like with a bunch of humans, like I think she's going to be at Bronwyn's village, I'm just looking at some set photos. If she should like glaringly stand out from everybody there. And so far, that element just doesn't seem to be present in the little clips we've seen. And now maybe you may think, well, that's a silly thing to be so going on so much about, but it really is this is like a massively big thing in reality, in story, in canon. So those are the three main reasons, and there's a whole host of other reasons. So just plot-wise that, you know, aren't anything at all like what actually happened in the story. But those are the three main reasons why I'm going to be approaching it as kind of just a loosely inspired fan fiction story. That will allow me to probably enjoy it a lot more, because if I went into this viewing it as, you know, looking for a canonical adaptation, yeah, I wouldn't last 5 minutes, I don't think, into the show. So, and this is what allows me to enjoy seasons 5 through 8 of A Game of Thrones more than I would otherwise. I don't treat them the same way I treat the first 4 seasons, because the first 4 seasons are a legitimate adaptation. The last 4 seasons are not. We'll see how this goes. I just hope it's a good story. I hope the parts that are good there's more of than the parts that are bad. And there's going to be some bad parts in this, like Galadriel running up the sword blade and leaping through the air like she's Neo in the Matrix, like level ridiculousness, which we've seen already in a kind of a very short clip. So we'll see. I mean, it's fantasy, so I hope it does well. They're, I think, committed for 5 seasons. And because they moved their entire production company from New Zealand, I think, to England, because most likely, like pandemic restrictions were just too much of an interference or something down there. They have time to, I think, see the reaction and maybe course correct some things, but we'll see. They also might have the opportunity to acquire more rights to more parts of Tolkien's story while they're making the show. So there's 4 more seasons, because it's going to take a while to write and film all those seasons. So who knows, they might acquire the rights to more parts that can let them bring more canon-specific things in. We'll see. But right now, they have very little of Tolkien's material to actually work with. It's, I think, mostly, in terms of Second Age-related things, it's the appendices in Return of the King. They don't have, like, the Silmarillion, like, version of the Second Age. And that limits and restricts, like I think, what they can use, even in terms of names. Like, Sauron's disguised as Anatar, like the Lord of Gifts or Giver of Gifts in the actual Second Age. Like, he disguises himself as like this most beautiful angelic member of the elves, and goes to Eregion and befriends Celebrimbor and begins like working him towards the building, crafting the rings of power. And they don't have the rights to the name Anatar. It doesn't appear in the appendices, so which is why I suspect that Sauron will be in disguise, but just a completely different disguise, because they don't have the rights to the Anatar disguise. My biggest worry, and one last thing, my biggest worry actually in everything is the dialogue. If you've noticed, we've gotten such tiny little dialogue, and the little bit we have been shown is really generic, tropey stuff. I haven't heard any of the actual dialogue that we've been given. None of it has any Tolkien-esque like cadence or ring or sound to it at all. It's all been just, you haven't seen what I've seen. I've seen my share. You haven't seen what I've seen. And the past is dead. It's like Last Jedi level, like cringy dialogue. And one thing about that, I could see a Númenórean saying the past is dead. We either move forward or die with it. But that would be one of the Kingsmen, Anatar's side, that ideological faction of Númenor would say something like that, because their whole ideology is defying the gods, breaking away from the gods, demanding to be given immortality. They want to bury the past and become a new people. And Elendil, the one they have saying the line, is the last Númenórean on that world that would ever say the past is dead. Because the ideological construct of the faithful, which he's one of the leaders of, is holding to the past, honoring the gods, trying to find their way back into the good graces of the divine. So they want to restore what they lost as humans and Númenóreans. So why would Amazon have Elendil, of all people, say that past is dead line? That kind of stuff really worries me, because not only is that tropey nonsense kind of dialogue, but to have Elendil say it, it's like, it makes me worry that the showrunners and the writers don't understand these characters at all. Either that, or they do understand them and they're deliberately giving them lines they would never say because there's some sort of sadistic people who like to destroy an intellectual property. I don't believe that that's what they're doing, but they should know that this guy would not say that, of all people. Anyway, minor quibble, though I think that might end up being what probably I'll dislike more than anything is probably going to be the dialogue, because the odds that any of these writers know how to write like Tolkien at all is probably pretty slim. And because this isn't a fully fleshed out novel like the Lord of the Rings trilogy was, they don't really have like dialogue. They just have to kind of figure out how Tolkien writes and how he would write dialogue for these characters. And so far, the tiny little bit we've got is, it's not cutting it. But anyway, I'm going to cut this video short. Otherwise, I could just go on and on. Hell, I could do an hour-long rant on just Galadriel's hair being touched. I am going to do, I think, a kind of a discussion video after each episode. I mean, Tolkien is my all-time favorite author. Legendarium is my all-time favorite work in literature. And I will be watching. And, hey, it's really fun content to talk about. And I'll look forward to the good parts, and I will look forward to laughing my ass off at the ridiculous parts. And I'll probably be ranting about some other parts. We'll see. It all depends upon what story they actually give us. So, until then, I am Charles, SirBookSage. Happy reading.